The golden hues of the setting sun painted long shadows across the bustling airport terminal, casting a warm glow over the sea of travelers moving with a purpose. The air was thick with the scent of freshly brewed coffee, jet fuel, and a quiet sense of urgency that always lingered in places like this. Flight announcements crackled over the intercom, blending into the rhythmic symphony of rolling suitcases and hurried footsteps. Among the crowd, a man in an expensive yet unassuming navy blue suit walked with a steady, composed stride. His sharp, piercing eyes scanned the terminal, taking in every detail, not just as a passenger, but as someone with a deeper stake in the world around him. Ethan Carter was not just another first-class traveler. He was the owner of the very airline he was about to board. Yet tonight no one knew that. The multimillionaire entrepreneur had spent years building his company from the ground up, ensuring every detail of Skylux Airways reflected his vision of luxury and excellence. But in recent months, rumors had reached his ears. Whispers of declining service, complaints from passengers, and a growing sense of disconnect between management and the employees. At first, he brushed them off as exaggerations. After all, how bad could it be? But the reports persisted, and if there was one thing Ethan despised, it was the idea of his company slipping into mediocrity. So tonight, he was no longer Ethan Carter, CEO of Skylux Airways. Tonight, he was simply Ethan Walker, a businessman traveling to New York. With a first-class ticket in his hand, he was about to experience what his customers did, without the filters, without the special treatment. As he approached the VIP lounge, Ethan's sharp gaze caught something. A pair of flight attendants standing near the check-in counter, whispering among themselves. At first, he did not think much of it, but the way one of them gestured toward a clipboard, shaking her head in frustration, made him pause. He adjusted his cufflinks, stepping into the lounge while subtly observing them from the corner of his eye. The obedient first stewardess, a tall brunette with a sharp, professional demeanor, sighed heavily as she glanced over the first-class manifest. Ugh, another night, another round of entitled rich guys who think they own the world, she muttered under her breath. Her companion, a younger woman with blonde curls tucked into a neat bun, chuckled dryly. I know, right? And do not get me started on the big boss. Have you ever even seen him, Ethan Carter? Rumor has it he is some arrogant control freak who only cares about money. Ethan froze mid-step. His name, his reputation, spoken like a curse in his own airline. He felt a slow burn creep into his chest, but he kept his expression unreadable. Was this what his employees thought of him? A cold, detached billionaire sitting in some ivory tower unaware of what happened below? He had always believed in leading with fairness and ambition, but now standing in his own lounge, hearing his name mocked like a villain in a story, he realized something unsettling. Somewhere along the way, he had become a stranger in his own company. Instead of reacting, Ethan made his way toward his designated boarding gate, his mind racing. Had he failed to connect with his employees? Were there deeper problems within Skylux that he had ignored? Or worse, was he truly the kind of leader they believed him to be? The moment he stepped onto the plane, the tension became more tangible. The polished veneer of luxury was there, gleaming. Seats, ambient lighting, the faint scent of expensive cologne lingering in the air. But something felt off. The atmosphere lacked the warmth, the genuine hospitality he had once envisioned. Instead, there was a subtle stiffness in the staff's smiles, a mechanical precision in their greetings. As Ethan took his VIP seat, he could not shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. And then, as he settled in, he overheard it. Just a few seats behind him, the same two stewardesses from before were still talking, their voices now hushed, but not enough to go unheard. I swear, if I have to deal with another VIP guest who thinks they are above basic manners, I might lose it, the brunette muttered. The blonde sighed. You should be grateful we do not have the body's big boss himself on board. Can you imagine? Ethan Carter? Ugh. I bet he is the worst of them all. Probably expects us to bow when he walks in. Ethan clenched his jaw, his fingers tapped absently against the armrest, his heart pounding, not with anger, but something deeper. Disappointment, a bitter sense of realization. Whatever it was enough to make him see one thing clearly. He had come undercover expecting to find minor flaws. But instead, he had uncovered a festering wound. And he was right in the middle of it. The flight had not even taken off yet, and already Ethan knew. This was going to be a long night. Ethan Carter leaned back into the plush leather of his first-class seat, the murmurs of the stewardesses still ringing in his ears. His expression remained calm, unreadable, but inside, his thoughts churned like a storm. He had built Skylux Airways with a vision, a dream of excellence, a promise of quality, a company that stood above the rest. But now, sitting in the very luxury he had worked so hard to craft, he could feel the cracks in its foundation, and he hated it. As the plane doors sealed shut and the captain's voice crackled over the intercom with the usual pre-flight announcements, Ethan turned his gaze toward the window, watching the last glimpses of the tarmac as the aircraft prepared for takeoff. This was not how things were supposed to be. It had taken years of sacrifice, sleepless nights, and countless failures to build this airline. Ethan had never been handed anything on a silver platter. Unlike the assumptions of his employees, he was not born into wealth. His father, Daniel Carter, had been a pilot, a man of integrity, discipline, and quiet strength. Ethan had grown up watching him leave for long flights, always carrying the same worn leather duffel bag and the scent of jet fuel clinging to his uniform. But more than anything, he remembered his father's words. "Son, it is not the plane that makes a journey smooth. It is the people flying it." Those words had stayed with Ethan long after his father's tragic accident. A mechanical failure. A fatal crash. A headline that shattered their family. He had been just 19 when it happened, young, ambitious, and suddenly burdened with the weight of loss. His mother had struggled to keep the house. Bills piled up. College seemed like a distant dream. And Ethan? He had no choice but to fight. From scrubbing floors at an old diner to working graveyard shifts at an airport baggage claim, he had clawed his way up, one painful step at a time. Every dollar saved had gone toward his vision. Every setback had fueled his determination. And now, after everything, after all those sacrifices, his own employees thought he was some out-of-touch billionaire who did not care. The thought made his grip tighten around the armrest. Maybe he had failed. Not in business, but in something deeper, something more important. He had built an empire. But had he lost its soul? A sudden voice snapped him out of his thoughts. "Excuse me, sir. Can I offer you something to drink?" Ethan turned, meeting the gaze of a stewardess. But not just any stewardess. This was one of them, the brunette from earlier, the one who had spoken so freely about her distaste for VIP passengers. For a fleeting second, there was no recognition in her eyes. To her, he was just another wealthy traveler, another entitled businessman. "Scotch," Ethan said smoothly, his voice even. "Neat." She gave a tight, polite smile, the kind of smile that did not reach her eyes. Right away. As she walked away, Ethan watched her. Not just her movements, but the stiffness in her posture, the slight sigh as she turned toward the galley. It was subtle, but it was there. Discontent. Resentment. A lack of pride in her work. And she was not the only one. Throughout the cabin, Ethan observed everything. The flight attendants exchanging tired glances, the forced pleasantries, the way they handled passengers with robotic efficiency, but lacked warmth. Something was missing. The culture had changed, and he needed to find out why. A few minutes later, the brunette stewardess returned, placing his glass of scotch on the tray table. "There you go, sir," she said, her voice as smooth as the drink she served, but her eyes flickered with something else, something cautious. Had she realized she had spoken about him earlier? Ethan picked up the glass, swirling the amber liquid before taking a slow sip. "What is your name?" he asked, his tone casual, but purposeful. She hesitated, then straightened her posture. "Claire." "Claire," he repeated, letting the name settle. "How long have you been with Skylux?" Another hesitation. "Almost 4 years." Ethan gave a thoughtful nod. "That is a long time." She forced a smile, but there was something guarded in her expression. "Yes, sir." He could feel the tension in the air, the silent wariness of an employee unsure why a VIP passenger was engaging her in conversation. But before he could press further, a voice interrupted. "Claire," another stewardess called from the aisle. The blonde from earlier, the other one who had spoken about him. Ethan turned slightly, watching as the two exchanged a look, a silent message. Something unspoken between them. The blonde cleared her throat. "Sorry to interrupt, sir. Just making sure everything is all right." Ethan held her gaze, then smiled slightly. Perfectly fine. But inside he was anything but fine. Something was off. And he was going to find out what. As the flight progressed, Ethan continued his quiet observations. It was in the way the attendants carried themselves, the hushed conversations in the EU galley, the lack of enthusiasm in their service. And then he caught something else. Seated a few rows ahead was an older gentleman, clearly frustrated. He had been trying to get the attention of a flight attendant for several minutes. His call, button lit up, Ethan watched as Claire passed by, and ignored it. His jaw clenched. That was not just poor service, that was neglect. The man sighed, grumbling under his breath before shifting uncomfortably in his seat. Ethan did not hesitate. He rose, stepped forward, and leaned toward the older man. "Everything all right, sir?" The man looked up, surprised. "Oh, I was just hoping for a glass of water, but I suppose they are busy." Ethan glanced toward the galley, where the attendants stood in whispered conversation. They were not too busy. They just did not care. His pulse pounded. When had this become the standard? He turned back to the passenger with a reassuring smile. "I will take care of it." And then, before he could even think twice, he walked straight to the galley. Claire and the blonde stewardess looked up, startled. "Is there a problem, sir?" Claire asked, her voice carrying an edge of controlled professionalism. Ethan's expression remained calm, but his words were laced with something sharper. "There is a passenger who has been waiting quite a while for water," he said evenly. Not an accusation, not yet, but a test. The blonde stewardess blinked, then quickly grabbed a glass and moved toward the cabin. Ethan did not move. He kept his gaze on Claire, watching as she shifted uncomfortably under his scrutiny. He did not need to say anything. She knew. But she had no idea just how much he knew. And as he returned to his seat, taking another sip of his scotch, a single thought settled deep in his mind. This was no longer just about undercover observations. Something was very, very wrong with Skylux Airways, and Ethan Carter was going to fix it, no matter what it took. Ethan Carter sat still, the weight of his thoughts pressing against his chest as the hum of the engines filled the first-class cabin. The scotch in his hand had lost its warmth, but he held onto the glass anyway, rolling it between his fingers as his mind churned through everything he had seen so far. The service was not just lacking, it was fractured. Disengaged employees, ignored passengers, the very people representing Skylux were treating customers as burdens, not guests. This was not a minor issue. This was rot. And rot, left unchecked, spreads. Ethan exhaled slowly, the crisp air of the cabin doing little to cool the heat rising in his chest. Something had gone wrong at Skylux. But was it negligence? Discontent? Or something worse? The answer, he suspected, sat just a few rows behind him. Claire. She and the blonde stewardess had been too quick to judge him, too at ease in dismissing. Passengers too comfortable, mocking the very man who signed their paychecks. Employees only spoke that freely when they felt untouchable, and people only feel untouchable when they believe that real power is not watching. He was about to find out why. A sharp tap on his armrest pulled him from his thoughts. "Excuse me, sir." Ethan turned, meeting the narrowed gaze of a man standing beside his seat. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing the crisp uniform of a Skylux flight supervisor. His name tag read, Marcus Hayes. "Is there an issue?" Ethan asked, his voice carefully neutral. Marcus gave him a polite but firm smile, the kind that masked something colder beneath. "I just wanted to check. If everything is all right, we noticed you speaking with the crew earlier." Ethan raised an eyebrow, so they were watching. "Just an observation," he said smoothly. "It is my first time flying Skylux in a while. I was getting a feel for things." Marcus's smile barely twitched. "We do our best to accommodate all passengers, but if there is any concern, I encourage you to let me know directly rather than—" His gaze flickered toward the galley, where Claire had disappeared moments earlier. Bringing it to the crew. Hikes there it was, subtle, controlled. A warning wrapped in customer service politeness. Marcus was protecting someone, or something. Ethan nodded slowly, setting down his scotch. "Of course, I will keep that in mind." Marcus studied him for a second longer before offering another tight smile. Then he turned and strode back down the aisle. Ethan exhaled, his fingers drumming against the armrest. The pieces were coming together. Marcus was not just an attentive supervisor. He was a keeping tabs you on interactions, monitoring who said what. Why? Ethan's instincts sharpened. Marcus was part of the problem. And now, Ethan had a feeling he had just put himself on the man's radar. This flight was about to get interesting. 30 minutes later, the cabin lights dimmed for evening service. Soft music hummed through the speakers, a manufactured sense of peace settling over first class. The passengers around Ethan sank into their seats, some scrolling through tablets, others closing their eyes. He stayed alert. A few seats ahead, Claire reappeared, carrying a tray of champagne flutes. Her expression was tight. She had seen Marcus talking to him. As she passed, her eyes flickered toward Ethan. A moment too long. A silent assessment. Ethan let the silence stretch before speaking. Noticing something? Claire hesitated before turning toward him. Her professional mask remained in place, but her shoulders were stiffer than before. "Just doing my job, sir." Ethan leaned back. "That is good to hear." She swallowed, once barely noticeable, before placing a champagne flute on his tray. "Enjoy." As she walked away, Ethan knew. She was nervous. Something about his presence, about Marcus noticing him, had put her on edge, and that meant she was involved in whatever was happening on this plane. Ethan tapped his fingers on the tray, watching as Claire disappeared toward the back. Time to push a little harder. He unbuckled his seatbelt and stood. The galley was quieter than expected. Claire was standing by the coffee machine, but she was not alone. The blonde stewardess, whose name tag read Jessica, was with her. They were whispering. Ethan took a slow step closer. He was asking too many questions, Claire muttered, her arms crossed. Jessica shook her head. "Just let Marcus handle it, he always does." Claire exhaled sharply, then glanced toward the cabin. When she spotted Ethan standing a few feet away, her whole body stiffened. Jessica turned, her eyes widening slightly. For a brief second, no one moved. Then Claire plastered on a fake smile. "Can we help you with something, sir?" Ethan tilted his head slightly, studying them both. "Yes," he said smoothly. "I was wondering if I could have a word." Jessica shot Claire a glance before turning on her heel and walking briskly toward the back. Avoidance. Ethan turned his attention back to Claire. So, Skylux Airways. 4 years, you said? Her lips pressed together. That is right. Do you like it? A flicker of something crossed her face. Too fast for most to notice, but Ethan caught it. Of course. Lies. Ethan crossed his arms. And Marcus? Seems like a very involved supervisor. Claire's fingers twitched at her sides. We work as a team. Ethan let the silence stretch. Another test. Claire looked away first. I have a feeling there is more to it than that, Ethan said quietly. For a split second, he thought she might break. Her lips parted as if to say something, hesitation clear in her eyes. Then, her entire posture snapped back into place. I should get back to work. She spun on her heel and strode past him back into the cabin. Ethan exhaled, running a hand down his face. She knew something. They all did. But they were afraid. Afraid? Of to what, or who? As Ethan returned to his seat, a deep unease settled in his gut. Something was bigger than just bad service. And then, it happened. The seatbelt sign flickered on. The intercom buzzed. Marcus's voice came through, smooth and professional. Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing some minor turbulence. Please remain seated as we adjust our flight path. Ethan frowned. Outside, the sky was clear. No clouds, no storms, no reason for turbulence. His fingers clenched the armrest as a slow, unsettling thought crept into his mind. This was not turbulence. This was a move. And Ethan had just become a target.